Hello and welcome to the first chapel service for the Bangalore Conservatory in 2024. When I'm speaking in chapel this year, I would really like to continue through this book. I'm going to take a look at a few verses from the book of 2 Timothy. We'll take a look at chapter 1. I'm not going to read every verse, but Paul gives this introduction to in his letter to his protege, his student, Timothy. It looks like Timothy was pretty young. Maybe he was about your age. And it looks like Paul was pretty old. He may have been about my age. So I can really relate to the words that Paul is saying here. And I think probably, when we think about it, probably all of us can relate to these words. I'm going to take a look at 2 Timothy chapter 1, verses 6 and 7. We'll be focused primarily on verse 6. For this reason, we'll talk about the reason in just a second, I remind you to fan into flame the gift of God which is in you through the laying on of my hands. For the Spirit of God, the Spirit God gave us, does not make us timid, but gives us power, love, and self-discipline. Now, first, for this reason. In the opening verses, Paul describes Timothy and his faith and says that he believed the faith that was in Timothy was given to him kind of as an inheritance from his mother and his grandmother. My guess is there are a lot of us here that can really relate to that. We are doing the work that we're doing. Many of us were enabled to get into music and into ministry because our parents lived by faith, and they were willing to encourage us and to support us in doing what we felt God had called us to do. So Paul is reminding Timothy of this heritage and saying for this reason he needs to be motivated to do the necessary spiritual work. We all need to think about our heritage. Now there might be, I know that there are a few of us in our group that are first generation believers, followers of Jesus. For those of us who fit into that category, we still are a part of a heritage. It's a very rich heritage that we all share. And that is the heritage of faith that goes back through the ages. There are faithful believers that we can be inspired by. I feel like I learned how to think from C.S. Lewis, just as one example, but he died a few years before I was born. There are members of the faith that are a part of this heritage of faith and faithfulness that is passed on to us, going back through those generations. People again like C.S. Lewis or J.R.R. Tolkien or Thomas Aquinas or Augustine or Boethius or these great people of the faith, and you can go all the way back to the Bible. Peter, James, John. The faithful described in the Bible, even with all of their faults, they're followers of Jesus. And going back to the Old Testament, the magnificent prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, David, who was very, very imperfect, but he loved the Lord. Moses, these great examples of the faith all the way back to Abraham. We are a part of this heritage, so the writer of Hebrews says that we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses. Seeing that, let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame that is set down on the right hand of the glory of God. We have this spiritual heritage that we have to take as a means, kind of motivation to drive us to do what is necessary for our spiritual health. Now, because of this, I remind you. Now, in order to remind, you have to mind. In other words, Paul had already told Timothy that he needed to fan into flame that gift that God had placed within him. So he's telling him again and again and again. As the writer of the book of Hebrews said, we need to think about, consider how we might spur one another on towards love and good works. We have to remind each other again and again to do the things that are necessary for our health. It's true of anything if you're wanting to pursue excellence. There's some things that need to be repeated. This morning itself, I did my usual morning vocal exercises. I actually went into a washroom so I wouldn't disturb everybody in the household because I did my vocal exercises both before and after everybody was awake. And they're kind of silly and kind of loud. And I just have to do it for my voice to function normally. In order for my voice to do what I demand of it as a musician, I have to do regular exercises. When I don't, I really feel the difference. It's true in our spiritual faith as well. There's certain things that bear repetition. They actually require repetition. Our spiritual health is like that. So Paul, because of the spiritual heritage that we have, reminds Timothy of what he reminds all of us of. And that is that we need to fan into flame. It's this beautiful image. Fanning into the flame. Obviously, many of us have attended barbecues, even during Christmas time, may have had a little experience with this very recently. Where you light the fire and the flame isn't quite what you want it to be, so you make sure that there's enough oxygen getting into the flame, because oxygen is what actually allows the flame to burn. If you eliminate the oxygen from the atmosphere, the fire dies. For us, for our spiritual walk, for our faith, time alone with the Lord and time in His Word are like the oxygen, the air that makes it possible for the fire God places within us to burn. Now that image is really interesting to me for a lot of reasons. One is there's more than one language where we use fire as a kind of image or a metaphor of diligence and hard work and energy. It's South Indian language that if you, sometimes it's happened that for example, I'll be a little late in getting my insurance payment in for the car. I just haven't been bothering about it, and we're down to the last minute, and like the day that it's due, I go ahead and take care of it. And she'll say, "You don't have fire." Now she says it in her home language from Kerala. And I'm not going to say it, because if I say it, then you'll laugh about my accent. But she'll tell me, "You don't have fire." She's told me that more than once. And there's some truth in that. Interesting that that is the image. You don't have the fire. That is a secular phrase, but it definitely has some spiritual implications. I think it's actually very biblical. If you are not on top of things, if you're not doing things the way they're supposed to be done, that's an indication you don't have that fire burning within you that drives you to do what you need to do. So Paul is saying we need to fan into flame that gift that God placed in us. We may think, oh, God gives us spiritual gifts, that's all we need. To a certain extent, that's kind of true, but it's basically not true. We have to be proactive in developing the spiritual gift that God places within our hearts. So we have to go out of our way to do those things that cause the fire to burn, that ignite that light that He placed within us. And there are times that the light can become dim, that the fire can become an ember, that the warmth that God places in us waxes cold, that the light that He shines in our hearts becomes dimmed because we're seeing it only through a glass darkly. That the beauty, the joy, the pleasure of our relationship with God is something that we become anhedonic about. We become numb. I think most of you know some of the things that have happened in my own life in the last 8 months or so. And I will confess to you, over the course of the last 4 months, really over the course of the last 8 months, I have gotten numb, for lack of a better way of putting it. Just gotten to where it's difficult for me to hear the voice of the Lord. I have to spend time just like everybody else. But to have the peace and the joy and that sense of God's presence, those warm, beautiful feelings that come with the Spirit of God dwelling in us, those are things that have not come automatically for me. And for the last few weeks, I've had to go back to old habits of spending time with the Lord and of getting into His Word before I'm now beginning to feel normal again. And by normal, I mean being a genuinely spiritual person who hears the voice of the Lord and is seeking His will and hearing His voice and being obedient to what He calls us to do. Now, my experience is not unique. Go in the Bible and there are a bunch of people who describe something similar. David wrote a song. He said to God, crying out to God, "Restore to me the joy of my salvation." Apparently he lost the joy of his salvation because of his disobedience, but that's a different context. Moses, really interestingly, would go into the presence of God and he would start glowing. And then he'd come into the presence of the people of Israel and the glow would go away. So Ichabod, the glory would depart. So he got into the habit of putting a veil over his face when he'd come out of the presence of God. Now he didn't put the veil over his face because he was afraid of scaring people with his glowy face. He put the veil over his face because he didn't want people to see the glow fade over time. So how would he get that glow back? He would have to go back into the presence of the Lord. You see, we become like the one we worship. Our God is light. In Him there is no darkness. He dwells, as one of the Psalms says, in unapproachable light. The prophet says that God is light, and in Him there is no darkness whatsoever. Jesus said, "I am the light of the world. He who believes in me will not walk in darkness." So, light and flame, they're related to each other. I hope you're following what I'm saying. How do you fan into flame that gift that God has placed within you? Well, the first thing is to be with the Lord, to spend that time with Him in prayer. When we spend time with Him, we begin to become like Him. Jesus said, "I am the light of the world," and then He also said to His disciples, He said to all of us, "You are the light of the world." Now, it's not just you as an individual, it's all of us. Ye are the light of the world. Now, a light, you don't take it and cover it. You know, the old term is a bushel. You don't put a basket over it, over a light. You put it up in a high place. You put it so that it can give light to everybody in the room. So our light can become kind of extinguished. But Jesus exhorts us to let our light so shine that people are drawn to God, to give Him glory. We have to fan into flame that gift that He has placed inside of us. So, 3 things. 1, we need to think about our motivation and realize that there is a destiny that we are a part of. Since before the foundation of the world, we're part of a calling that previous generations have handed down to us. And because of that, we need to remember and to remind each other to fan into flame, to proactively pursue those things that cause us to be reignited in the fire, the flame that God places in our hearts, so that we can glow, so we can shine, so people can see Jesus in us. We have to do this on an ongoing basis. And I would encourage all of us, this year, let's make this the year of fanning into flame the fire that God has placed in our hearts. That fire to do His will, that flame to become musicians, and not just musicians, but good musicians, great musicians, who can make a difference in this world. You know our theme. Building people to build a better world through music. That's not a trite statement. It's real. Through music, we can encourage and strengthen and transform people's thinking so that they can become better people. We can inspire people to become better and to make better choices and to do the things that are necessary to make the world a better place. It's real. And we're part of that heritage because of the calling God has placed in our lives. So I encourage every single one of you. In fact, I know I'm not there and this is a video, but just say to the person next to you, fan the flame. Just go ahead, say it to the person next to you. Turn to the person on the right, say, fan the flame. That may not work all that well, because some of you need to turn left in order to get that message. Turn to the person next to you, say, fan the flame. Let's fan that flame to get that burning in our hearts, reignite it, so that this can be a year where the warmth and the beauty and the pleasure and the joy and the light of God's presence and calling in our lives are genuinely experienced by us, and that we become an inspiration to everybody around us to have that same kind of joy, that same calling on their lives to see God working in them to make the world a better place. God bless you. Have a wonderful semester and study well. Keep fanning into flame, that flame that God has placed within you, the gift that He's given you. In Jesus' name, amen.